Okay. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. And I thank you all for coming because I realize we're up against that really great session with the Scratch programming and the Legos and the Rube Goldberg machine. So I feel very honored that people skip that to come and learn about the IPython notebook. And we only have 50 minutes, and so I'm going to jump right in, and hopefully more people will trickle in. My name is Becky Sweger. I have been doing IT for about 20 years, most of that doing very data-intensive things. I was quite the COBOL programmer back in my day, did a lot of really wicked Y2K work, but now I am currently the Director of Data and Technology at National Priorities Project. We are a federal budget research organization. We're nonprofit, nonpartisan, nationwide. And what that really means is we think it's important for people to understand how the federal budget works and how we spend our tax dollars as a country because it reflects our priorities. And just as an aside, we were nominated in 2014 for the Nobel Peace Prize. So we are in very good company with people like Edward Snowden, let's see, who else? The Pope, and also Vladimir Putin, unbelievably, is also nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. So they announced those in October. Stay tuned. Very exciting. Luckily, we are not here today on this Saturday to talk about the federal budget, although you may see some budgety type data floating around in some of my notebooks. But we're going to talk about this thing called the IPython notebook, and I think we'll start with just going over what it is, because when I was developing this talk and pitching it, I had a really hard time figuring out what is a good elevator synopsis of what an IPython notebook is and what it can do for you. So we're going to the best way is really just to look at one and then talk about some problems that we have and some problems that it can help solve. This is a tool that came out of the scientific programming community, and it solves some of their problems, and it has a lot of traction there. But I think the IPython notebook can really solve some of our problems as well. And then the thing that I really think is the most important is going over how anybody can get an IPython notebook up and running pretty easily. And if there's time, which there likely will not be, we can do some next steps beyond the basics. And just, what we can't do, because this isn't a hands-on session, is go into great detail about the technical architecture behind the IPython notebook. We can't troubleshoot specific installation problems, but I'm here afterwards, and I'm really passionate about this. I'm happy to talk to anybody about it, and my contact information is here, so you can always email or get me on Twitter. So just before we jump in, is anybody here a Python programmer already? Great. So this is a good tool for you, and I saw someone go like this. Are there people out there who are trying to learn how to program in Python? Yeah.
I can use I can also see that, but it mainly just as like calculator.
Calculator.
Just because I think like doing job. You have one line of do anything. You have only one line and like and then that's the reason why I really like because it's like basically came from both lines, like and like it has
Right. IPython is a great, it's a vast improvement over the interactive terminal that comes with just regular Python.
I was going to say, one of the things that I've been interested in is looking at various languages for scientific data analysis, and there seems to be a split with some people going with Python and other people going with R, and so I'm trying to figure out where to invest my time. So that's why I'm here, and if you can anything you can say that would help me distinguish between IPython and R Markdown and kind of strengths and weaknesses.
Well, it depends, Steve, which is the typical answer to all of those types of questions. And I just want to tell people, if you're not a Python programmer, IPython is technically a language agnostic product. And Andy here told me the other day, and I think this makes a lot of sense, that they're going to take the language agnostic parts out of IPython and rename them Jupyter, with a Y, of course. I don't know if they're going to call it Jupyter. I hope not. Well, I'm just going to call it Jupyter. And the first thing to know about IPython and the IPython notebook, capital I, capital I. Do not write, if you're tweeting in here, do not type IPython with a lowercase I. The developers seem to get really angsty and touchy about that. So capital I, capital P, Python. So the IPython notebook. So it is a component of something larger called IPython, and down here at the bottom of the slide you can see all of the things that make up this universe. Again, this is a suite of tools that was developed by the scientific programming community, but I think there's a lot here for people who are trying to learn how to code in general, people who are trying to learn Python specifically, and just other people who want better ways to share the work that they're doing. So you can, I mean, this is a vast oversimplification, but you can think of IPython as two basic components. One is obviously the kernel of the programming language that you are talking to, and the second part of the components are the clients that they provide for you to talk to those kernels. So they do have a terminal, like they have a console, they have Qt console, both of those are great, and we're not going to talk about those. We're going to talk specifically about the IPython notebook, and that is the web-based client that you can use to talk to any kernel. If there's been a kernel developed, I think there are IPython kernels developed in Haskell, Julia. I've seen a Ruby one. I don't know how robust it is, but of course IPython ships with the IPython kernel, and that is for Python coders. So, oh, I forgot to read this definition, which doesn't tell you anything. The IPython notebook is a web-based, interactive, computational environment where you can combine code execution, text, mathematics, plots, and rich media into a single document. And even reading that, it's still really difficult to visualize in your head what this thing actually is. So if you create an IPython notebook, you can write code, right? This is just Python code. You see the output. But you can also surround that by markdown text. You can surround it by LaTeX. So you can start putting all of these pieces together in one place. In that same document, you could add rich media like videos, and you can have inline plotting, which is where the value is for a lot of people in the scientific community. But even looking at all these separately, like they don't really show you the great thing that is the IPython notebook. So I think the best way to do that is just to look at one. And now I have all these windows open from this video thing. Here we go. Okay. I'm going to pop open a notebook here, and we're going to go back and into more detail after I show you how to install some of the tools and talk about how to set this up specifically. But this is a notebook, and you know, it does look very documenty, almost word processor-esque. So right here at the top, you know, you have a file menu, you have a toolbar, but really at the heart, an IPython notebook is just a compilation of cells. And so this is something that I started doing because I wanted to look at federal contract data, and I wanted to see how their federal contract dollars are flowing out to states in the country, and I wanted to look at the Department of Defense-based dollars versus non-Department of Defense-based dollars. And I wanted to put this all in one place because I work on a research team where I am the only programmer. So I needed a way to show this work to other people without sending them to places like GitHub, which are actually scary for people who aren't programmers. So this is a series of cells. This first cell here, if I click on it, you can see up here the markdown cell. There are several different types of cells you can have in a notebook, and this is executed already. So if I went into edit mode by double-clicking on the cell, you would see here my raw markdown. If I run the cell, it re-renders. Scrolling down, I have the next cell, and when I click on that, you can see that this is a code cell. This code actually doesn't generate any output, so you're not going to see anything if I run it. And then following here is another markdown cell. So the value here is being able to put my code, but give it context. So these data notes, if I've done them correctly, will tell my colleagues, hey, this is where she got the data, this is what the data represents, these are some of the fields that she used to aggregate it, and here are some of the other supplemental information she's using to adjust things for inflation and calculate per capita numbers. So we're getting into this concept of reproducible research. This right here is actually, this is enough information to tell my colleagues what I've been doing. I wouldn't publish this for public consumption. There's not quite enough information here. But you can see, hopefully you can start to see some of the value of having your code right up against, some of the supporting information about what you are doing. So right here, this is not something my colleagues would necessarily be interested in, but this is just some code that reads in some data that I have about the federal contracts. And this block of code does have output. I'm just looking at the first few rows of it just to make sure that everything is copacetic. So this is kind of allowing me to noodle around with the information in my head, but also get it down. Let's see. Down here, more noodling, and here's where we start to see something pretty cool, which is the ability to render plots inline. And then down here, I'm actually rendering a plot of this information for every state in the US. So this is interactive. So I think this bar chart here is actually showing us, let's see, what is it showing us? It is showing us Department of Defense contract dollars versus non-Department of Defense contract dollars for the United States. But if we wanted to look at that for Massachusetts, I can just change the code, run the cell, and out pops a new chart, like that. So at its core, this is an IPython notebook. One thing to point out, I can run the cells one at a time. You can also run all the cells at once, which is sometimes useful when you pop open a new notebook. And it's a kind of a strange UI, but this is the way you know the notebook is running. When this dot up here in the upper right is black, the notebook is running. There's also an indicator up here on the tab. When this dot goes back to a clear circle, the kernel is done. I think that's a bit of an odd UI feature. And I think it speaks to the fact that, once again, this came out of the scientific programming community. They're really talented people. They're not terrific with documentation, and they're not terrific with UI. And in fact, you can see that this notebook is, though useful, is pretty ugly. And just the last thing I'm going to point out while I'm in here, and it's kind of hacky, but you can force inject CSS into a notebook, and it just makes it a little bit nicer, especially if you're going to be showing this to people. It doesn't work terrifically at this resolution. So that is a notebook. Let me go back over here. And so what I did was a pretty basic use case. And I don't know how long these have been around. I think I want to say about 2 years ago I went to a presentation. So maybe 2.5 years ago they came out. And people have been doing some pretty interesting things with them. This is actually a visualization library for Python. And they have put all their documentation out in IPython notebook form. This is actually a pretty common use case. I mean, what better way to learn somebody's visualization library than to have them put it out in notebook form and allow you to take those notebooks and just run the code interactively. No more cutting and pasting code. In fact, if they've made a mistake, no more getting updates to your technical ebook that say, hey, please update the ebook. They just, they can push their changes right out here, and the fixes are all live. So this is obviously just a big markdown cell, but some of the tutorials here are more interesting notebooks. And the reason I like the ones from this particular visualization library is that they are showing off some of the new features of the IPython notebook, which involve interactive plotting. So those plots we were looking at in the federal contract notebook were static. These here are interactive. This is something I have not played with myself, but I'm very excited to sort of jump in there and do that. So that's one thing you can do. I've seen people actually publish their textbooks in IPython notebook form. I see people blogging with IPython notebooks. So I've been trying to think of more creative uses to do them. And I think even on NPP's website, when I publish notes and sources for a project and then put separate code out in GitHub, there might be a way to bring those together and just show them to people all in one place. And it's worth noting also that these slides that we're looking at now, I made in an IPython notebook. There is a little utility you can run behind the scenes that just takes the cells and it takes the output and it pops them into a reveal slideshow that you can use, which I think is very handy. So how does it help? When you were in elementary school and your math teacher said, even if you don't get the right answer, you still might get partial credit if you show your work. And as adults, I don't know that we always get partial credit for showing our work if we get the wrong answer. But there have been a number of high-profile incidents happening in recent years where people have really felt the effects of not making their research reproducible. So this is, again, more to the scientific community, but I'm getting there about how this can help the rest of us. So it's particularly pertinent here at UMass. The incident I'm thinking of specifically, Rogoff and Reinhardt, they're from Harvard, yes? Two Harvard economists, and they published a study that essentially said it is bad for countries to carry high levels of debt. And so policymakers who were proponents of, budget tightening and austerity relied heavily on this research to make their point. And there were some people here at UMass who were unable to recreate the numbers out of that study. They asked for, and they finally received, a copy of the Excel file that Rogoff and Reinhardt used. And a graduate student, lo and behold, found an error in the Excel formula. So this is a problem. And it turns out that these researchers had slightly overstated the effect of debt on these countries' economies. So there were two problems here. I mean, one problem is there's a lot of research being done in Excel formulas, which is a problem. And the other problem is, there were some assumptions inherent in their report that weren't well documented. So the idea is, if we can put all of our research in a format like a scientific notebook like this, then people can go in, they can see your code, it is less error prone, and people can also understand more the assumptions that you used and the methodologies that you used to generate your work. And there are some people who say that every scientific article should actually be published in a notebook like this. So there are a few examples of things like that happening, and I'm just going to buzz right through these. This is a BuzzFeed article about segregation in Ferguson. Right, so you see articles like this on the internet all the time. But what's interesting about what this author chose to do is he actually published an IPython notebook about how he got these numbers. So he talks about the data. You can see some of the census data that he used. And what I really like about this is you don't have to be a Python programmer to understand a little bit about the fields that he used to pull this information, right? You can see pretty clearly here he's getting things that pertain to race and ethnicity, to age and sex, and to where people are living. And he has it all written down, and he talks about the methodology he used to generate this index of dissimilarity. So he linked right out to it in his markdown, so if you want more information about it, you can go and get that. And the other thing that's really interesting about this, not only is this useful for people who want to see how he got the numbers, it's actually, this is the ethos of open source, right? I mean, he did this for Ferguson, but any reporter across the country could just take this notebook and download it and try to run the numbers for their own part of the country. In fact, I did this and I tried to run it for Hampshire County, and we don't even register on any index of dissimilarity. We were like pretty much a zero. I wanted to use that as a great example, but it did not work out. And one thing I'll point out while I'm here, unlike the notebook we were looking at with the contract data, this is not runnable. This is not an executable notebook. I am not running this locally on my machine. If you see here up in the URL, you can see this NB viewer. That is a notebook viewer. So it's essentially a static web service that takes an IPython notebook and renders a static HTML version of it that's really easy to share around. So that's why I can't work this notebook interactively. All right. Another example I liked, this was an article in Scientific American. This was a great plot about the effect of global warming on sea life, and again, there was an IPython notebook to back up the whole thing. I won't open it because, frankly, the data there made no sense to me. It's really not my area of expertise. But what I like about it is the very fact that the author took the time to document his methodology and talk about where he got the information that goes behind this plot gives me a little more confidence that it might be correct. So this brings us back to two things I think the IPython notebook can do for people like us who might not be in the scientific community, right? Sharing and learning. But when we say sharing, I like to say sharing without scaring. I think that we have a problem in technology, and at least I've observed this in the domain I work in, which is a lot of open government data. People have this habit of relying on what are great tools like GitHub, and actually I mean exclusively GitHub. It's kind of become the de facto way we share our work. But people throw things up in GitHub and call it a day. Hey, my code's on GitHub, I'm open, I'm good. It's there and anybody can look at it. Yes, anybody can look at it, but when you do that, you are really limiting who you can share things with. When you put things on GitHub, your technical colleagues can understand them, but that's kind of it. And even if you give somebody a link right to GitHub, they don't know what that is. It's an intimidating website. They don't understand what source control is. They can look at your code, but they can't see the output. they might be able to look at your documentation, but they can't see the code with it. Or you might be able to show them a GitHub page, which is your output, but then they can't see the code. So you just have all these disparate groups of people, and I think it's better to share with more people. And the thing I like about the IPython notebook is you can do the sharing without throwing away any of the tools that are so useful for us in our day-to-day lives, like GitHub. I'm going to show you in a few slides how the IPython notebook can sit right on top of GitHub, and your colleagues, your non-technical colleagues, can see one view of it. You can see another view of it. It's really the same thing, and everybody's happy. And then teaching. I'm going to open this notebook because it's just so meta. I love it so much. This is an IPython notebook about why it's really great to teach with the IPython notebook. And so this guy, it's actually kind of cool. He goes into a lot of educational theory. He talks about cognitive load and context switching. And I actually think those are really important points, because I had an intern over the summer, and he wanted to learn Python. And I thought about this, and he was coming from an econ background, and so he's a big Excel guy. He had never programmed before. And so we have, 6 weeks together in the summer, 4 days a week. And why am I going to throw a command line at this guy, right? He's got enough to deal with. He has to learn about the budget, and he has to learn about Python. There's no reason to give him a command line to learn on top of that. So we used an IPython notebook, and it worked out really well. So I think this has vast, vast potential as a teaching tool, and a lot of what I see happening at Nerds has been really inspiring. I see these kids writing Scratch programs, and I think, I think the next step for these kids is maybe to, set them up with an IPython notebook and show them a thing or two. So if you Google around, you'll see that a lot of computer science teachers are exploring this as a tool, and they do really clever things with it. They inject JavaScript in here, so you can put buttons that turn the outputs on and off, so you can essentially hide answers until the student is ready to see it. Very creative stuff. I try not to put JavaScript in anything if I can help it. So, that is IPython notebook in a nutshell. But now I want to jump into how you too can run an IPython notebook pretty easily. But before we do that, I will stop because I talk fast, and I want to see if there's any questions. Yeah.
I'm interested in, and I was, I finished working I had that in making more IDE like I have a site has all your files. I think I do more opportunity on that for to have the idea of having it's view of what you're doing. Is there any
Yeah, so I think the question was Python IDE, right? Is that?
Yeah, I find that in the browser, easy from feedback.
So, what we just looked at in the IPython notebook will give you instant feedback in the browser. The tool that I'm going to talk about right now also comes with an IDE. So it's not web-based, but it does what you're talking about, where you can sort of have one panel where you see all your files and another panel where you're running Python commands, and you can see everything as it goes by. Is that what you meant?
And the question was, is there any support things in PHP or C++?
That's a good question. I can't speak to languages specifically, but I do know I've looked at the IPython development road plan, and one of their big pushes, as is indicated by the name change, is the developer of kernels in other languages. And I didn't see PHP and C++ specifically on that list, so I don't know, to be honest. But when I start talking about Anaconda, I will make sure I pause where we get to the part where you can fire up the IDE and show you where that is. Any other questions? Okay. So to get started, I am a big advocate of some of these Python distributions that are out there, and I will tell you why. So for those who are new, I mean, a Python distribution simplified is essentially the Python environment with a lot of packages that extend its core capability bundled in on top of that in one executable that you just install. And the reason I like them is because I've wasted a lot of my life installing Python packages and trying to debug all the dependencies. And as great as the Python stack is for some of the work that I do, it's really terrible, especially if you're working on a Windows environment. Usually I work on a Linux virtual machine, but even as I was getting ready for this presentation, I tried to do it without the distribution, and it's just a waste of time. So Anaconda is a Python distribution that is for scientific and data-oriented computing primarily. And I will say, if you're just planning to write some Markdown code in your notebook and you are writing a little bit of Python code, Anaconda is a big distribution with a lot of packages, and it might seem like a pretty big hammer, but I still recommend it, and this is why. Because once you get started with the notebook, you'll be surprised at how quickly you want to move beyond basic Python. The next thing you're going to want to do is make a chart. And to make a chart, you need a graphing package. And then that starts the black hole of despair. Just despair and C compilers. It's awful. It's really awful. And then, so 4 hours later, you're still futzing with that, and you haven't learned anything. So take Anaconda, download it, install it, save yourself a lot of grief. And when you do that, you will, after you install it, fast forward to launcher. So on Windows, you can get to the launcher from your start menu. I don't really speak Mac, but this is from the Anaconda documentation. It's launcher.app. And the Anaconda launch screen looks like this. Comes with 3 things, and we're not going to talk about the first 2, but I will say Spider app is the IDE, and it's pretty decent, so I would definitely check that out. But IPython Notebook is what we're going to do, and the first time you open the launcher, you will have a green button that says install, not a blue button that says launch. But once you install it, button turns blue and you can launch, and a couple of different things are happening here. So you will see the IPython Notebook server starting to fire up. There we go. And then we'll open a browser tab. So I'm going to jump back to this for just a minute. So when you fire up the IPython Notebook, it runs a little server locally. And you don't really have to concern yourself too much with this. I just want to point out the top line here. It tells you where your IPython profile is. And there's a lot of customizations and tweaks that you can do in the IPython Notebook in general, and also in just the overall IPython environment. We won't have time to talk about those, but it's good to know where your profile is located. Yes, Steve.
I was just going to ask, so this is running on localhost, obviously. Is there a version that you can run on a server for multi-user use, and are there hooks to do that sort of thing?
Okay, back to the launcher. Oh, I picked the wrong screen resolution. The people at Continuum that put out the Anaconda distribution have a product called Wakari. Oh, thank you. Whoops. How did I do that? Yeah. Scroll down, scroll up. I have a really sensitive touchpad. Right, this one, right here. I believe this does that. I haven't looked at it extensively. And also on the roadmap, the next big release, or the next big thing that the IPython dev team is working on, small group sharing. And I think it will be something like that. So it's a good question. So once you've launched your notebook, this server. The other thing I'm going to point out in the server window here, the port number. The only reason that's important, I will just say quickly, by default, the IPython Notebook runs on port 8888. The only reason you would worry about that is if you are running this in a virtual machine and you want to access it via a browser in your host machine. Otherwise, you probably don't need to think about that so much. So what this does, it opens up the IPython Notebook landing page. And on Windows, by default, Anaconda is going to open that in your user directory. I'm not sure where it takes you on the Mac, but this is actually just sort of a very, again, scientific programmer-designed way to navigate through files. And it doesn't look too interesting until you navigate somewhere that actually contains a notebook. So here you see some .ipynb files. That's the IPython Notebook extension, and I will open one. And this is pretty similar to what we were looking at with the contract data, right? A bunch of text, a bunch of code. One thing that I want to point out before we go too much further, so you can see all of the cells here, but one thing that is great about the IPython notebook is behind the scenes, you know, this looks sort of fancy, but behind the scenes it's just a big JSON file. And I think it's very important to understand that because this is why we can work with it in source control and some of the other things that we like to do. There it is. That's all it is. So those cells, those graphs, that text, this is all it is behind the scenes, right?
Does it say the output is there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, the output's all there. That can kind of, you know, mess things up when you try to source control stuff. But people have developed, you know, commit hooks and other things that I haven't explored. But yeah, the output is all there.
You know, there are a couple of things that contain source code, like images, like the images included, like data. And so that you can have a file that's like really, that's time good.
Right, so the comment was if you have a lot of images in your notebook, you're saying that might be problematic to source control?
No, I mean to viewing the source code. It's, you have like code that are mainly big images, and they're opening
Right. Well, the thing is, the only reason I opened that file in Notepad++ was just to show everybody that it's a big JSON file behind the scenes. I don't know that there's actually a reason or a good use case for ever opening that up and editing the raw JSON file. So I don't know that you would run into that problem. If anybody can think of a use case, I'd be happy to hear it. But I've never once opened up the JSON file and made an edit to it. I mean, because it's a web-based editor. So if I wanted to write JSON, I would not use a web-based editor.
Is it trying to do something with blocks in there?
Yeah, they're there. Yeah, I'll show you something super cool later about, you know, sharing this around with the images. And frankly, to me, it's a little bit of magical black box. I don't know how the images get in there, but when you reopen the notebook, they're there. They're just there. That's one of the beautiful things about it. So, in fact, we should talk about that right now. So back to this Ferguson notebook. That one. So many notebooks. This is back to this BuzzFeed notebook. So again, this is the notebook viewer utility, but you can see up here actually that this is hosted on GitHub. So if I wanted to look at, you know, again, here's his raw JSON file. This is what's stored in GitHub. But when you go to the notebook viewer, you see this. It's just two different views of the same file. And how that works, this is the notebook viewer website. So if you have a URL of your online IPython notebook, you just pop that here and it pops out the link, right? So if we wanted to look at, I don't have this online. Let's see. Well, I won't do that. I can use this, guys, as an example. So here's his notebook in GitHub. I can put his link into notebook viewer, you know, and out pops the rendered HTML. This is the link that you give to people. And this is, you know, goes back to what I was saying about the sharing without scaring, right? Give people this. Don't ever give people this. give people this. And I use this on my colleagues, I use it on my boss, and I'm thinking about using it for our audience. I think another thing to remember is one of the most important people you can share with is your future self. I think we've all been victims of having not been left adequate instructions by our past selves. And especially, I work in a place where I get a data update once a year, right? So census data comes out once a year, and it's time for me to update it, and I don't remember what I did last week, let alone what I did last year when it was time to update the census data. So I've started leaving myself little notebooks because I could look at my code on GitHub, but that doesn't really tell me what I was thinking or what to do. This way I can put it all into one place. I've actually had a good experience with a vendor as well who did a visualization for us and delivered the documentation via the notebook. It worked out really nicely. One thing I forgot to tell you when I popped open that notebook. So many windows. Well, it really could be any notebook. When you open an IPython notebook from here, I'm going to open up another one. Right? So when you open a notebook, you are actually firing up an IPython kernel. So anything that you type in this notebook, be it up here or down here, is always going to communicate with that same IPython kernel. It's important to remember that because when you shut the tab in the browser, you have not shut down the kernel. The kernel is still running. It will stay running until you explicitly shut it down. If you're like me, sometimes you just open up a whole bunch of notebooks in different directories and you lose track. You can always click on the running tab here to see which notebooks are running. So in fact, if I open up this notebook again, any variables that I set the last time I was in here, they're still going to be here. Everything's still going to be here until you shut the kernel down. Sequoia.
Does it run stuff in the back? Like, why does it keep the kernel running easier rather than just run it, return the output?
I don't know. State.
Yeah, it doesn't know we have to tackle from there closer.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would buy that. Thank you. And one other thing I wanted to talk about, sharing notebooks, right? The notebook viewer is great, but you might not always want to put your notebook online. So the notebook viewer kind of depends on you having your notebook online somewhere. I think it can work with a private, is it gist or gist? How do you say that? Gist.
I don't know.
Like gist. I say gist in my head, but it's not a word I say out loud to people a lot. Yeah, I think it works with a private. Gist? Get the gist. Okay, that makes sense. So I think the notebook viewer will work with a private GitHub gist. It doesn't work with private repos. So you know, sometimes, like a lot of these notebooks are just me sort of, like I said, noodling around. It's not anything that I would want public, especially under National Priorities Projects repository. So if you want to share with people without putting your stuff online, you can go up here to the File menu and do a download as. And there's a couple options here. Oh man, my screen. I think I got it. Well, I should have just changed this resolution. So it's HTML. So you can download it as a straight up Python script, or you can download it as HTML. This is the part that I actually, frankly, don't really understand how it works. It's one HTML file, and you open it, and everything's there. Even the output, even the graphs. Yeah, right. Yeah, and then right. So you're an image guy, Lou, but I am not. And the reason I like IPython Notebook is I don't have to be. I can just download this as an HTML file, and I can send it to my colleagues, and it works, and everybody's happy. And then we can sort of look at this and decide. You know, we can look at these trends and think, is there anything more interesting for us to dig into here? I really like it for that reason. So, you know, there's a lot more I could say, and you know, my slides are online. I tweeted the link. There's two more things I had on there as sort of aspirational things to talk about, and one was specific cool features of IPython that are available to you in the notebook just because it's running on IPython. Specifically, things that make it go above and beyond the typical IPython console and are really good for learning. And then I just have a list of sort of advanced features of the IPython notebook. And I think I'm going to definitely skip this. There's a lot of neat things you can do. You should know that the IPython 3.0 is scheduled to drop this fall. I don't have a specific date. So some of these things I will caution you. I think specifically extensions. it's like the bad old days of Firefox. I don't know if anybody remembers installing Firefox extensions when Firefox first came out. It was really kind of kludgy and weird. But you can put extensions onto your IPython notebook. And I have two here. So these buttons here, if you create your own IPython notebook, you won't see these. These are extensions, and they were kind of kludgy to get in there. If you're going to explore that, I think the architecture is going to change in 3.0, so I would not, I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time there. But this one I like especially because it hides your input. So this is just, if you really want to go more down that sharing without scaring, you could take your code out and just show people the graph. This one doesn't work right. It fires up an inline slideshow, which is really cool in theory, but I haven't gotten it to work in practice. So there's that. Those are extensions. Does anybody have questions? Steve?
I noticed you have a link to our Markdown.
I did. Oh, right. You still want to talk about R?
If you're willing to take a minute.
Yeah, so I'm not an R coder, but can I say one thing before I talk about R? Because this is kind of important. I sort of, just basically glossed over the fact that while it's really cool that people can share a document with you that contains interactive code, there might be security considerations with that. And so just so you know, by default, IPython notebooks that are coming from a source other than you are in an untrusted state. And all that means is when you open an untrusted notebook, it can't execute code upon open. Now, you can tell it to execute code after you open it. The whole point of the IPython notebook is to give you executable code. But you can feel safe in downloading a notebook and opening it locally and sort of perusing the code yourself before you decide to run anything. So, you have a security question before I hit Steve?
Sam, I mean, is the stuff when you use Anaconda and the IPython server, does it like sandbox and stuff, or can I write like, cat? Shadow.
Oh yeah,
you can just type whatever, it has
for sure.
Full access of anything.
I mean, Anaconda installs in its own folder, but if it's running under you as a user and you as a user have privileges to execute those commands, yes, you could run them. Yeah. So R. For those who don't know, R is a statistical programming language. It is also open source, and they are also working on a notebook-like tool. It's called R Markdown. And Steve's question was about the viability of using Python for data analysis versus using R. And like I said, it depends. So 2 years ago, I got started with putting in a lot of federal budget data, and I realized quickly I needed a tool like this. R had a lot of memory issues, and I couldn't use it. And R is actually known for memory, just being a memory hog. I think that they have, and Andy, you might be able to speak to this more, I mean, I think they've been working to address that, and I haven't been in R much since that time. What I think is exciting is I see R as coming from a statistical programming analysis and morphing more into a general purpose environment. They've added sort of a beautiful soup-esque scraper into R. They've added a lot of great features, and Python started from a more general programming as a general programming tool, and they've developed a lot of great data analysis packages on top of it. So it almost feels like they're merging to the same place. I will say, if you're interested in reproducible research, R does not yet have anything equivalent to Python virtual environments, which means you can't quite, package up all of your work nicely and keep it isolated from your other work. So I see that as something that is not good, but I think R is working on that. But that's really all I can say about it. They're both open source communities. They both have great people that are continually developing these packages. So when students ask me that question, I actually tell them it depends on what's primarily used in the field they want to go into. That's what I would learn. I think the important thing is for people to learn one of them, because I'm tired of these people coming in and they steal Stata from the Smith library. And I'm like, you can't do that for the rest of your life. So you really should learn one of these open source languages if you're going to do statistical analysis.
There is an R kernel that works with Python.
Is there? Did you just Google that? Yeah. And I was.
R magic.
Yes, and I will tell you, this is a funny story, and I'm going to tell it because this is a conference that is about empowering people to get involved with technology. So to get ready for this presentation, I tried to get the R magic to work on Windows. And I did lose a couple hours of my life. And I had to do a registry hack. I mean, it was awful. I finally got it to work. And, you know, at the end of that, I thought, oh, God, I have no aptitude for technology. Why am I even in this field? God, I'm so stupid. It was, you know, it was the worst feeling. And so I thought, you know what, there might be like one or two other dumb people out there who couldn't figure this out. So I wrote it down on my blog, and then I tweeted the link. And then a person I had worked with, who's, you know, she's a Stanford PhD, she tweeted back, she's like, thanks, I never could get that to work. No. And then the person who developed IPython tweeted back, and he's like, oh, I didn't think you could do that in Windows. So, you know what, let this be a lesson. Sometimes it's just all about persistence, and you're not stupid. You're never as stupid as you think you are. But yeah, and so at that point I'd spent so much time trying to get R to work that I ran out of time to actually do anything with R for this presentation.
And the real lesson is don't use Windows.
Right. You know, I thought about doing this on my, you know, my virtual machine, but, you know, I wanted to, I don't know, I'm just stubborn or something, but I wanted to show that Windows can, even if you're a Windows user, you don't have to be put off by all of the Linuxy things that surround the Python environment. I mean, anybody can work this. They're for everybody. Yes?
Is Anaconda as valuable in a Linux environment, or is this one of those, like, it's hard to set up in Windows, so Anaconda is useful? Because I know with, like, XAMPP or something for, like, the LAMP stack, it's really super useful in Windows. I would never use it in Linux because I could just install it
right.
easily.
Right, that's a really good question. So if you just want to use IPython in the notebook, you can pip install it, no problem. It works great. So I'm an edge case because I use Linux, but I'm not really good at Linux. So I can make my virtual environment, and anything that pip installs, I'm fine with. But even on Linux, I found a lot of errors and things that didn't work, and packages that I had to install in Ubuntu, and that's where I get frustrated very quickly. Like things that you couldn't pip install into your virtual environment, so you had to do it some other way. So perhaps if you're very proficient in Linux, that wouldn't be a problem. For me, it was way more time than I wanted to spend.
Is it the image processing libraries you're mentioning?
This is the imaging processing libraries, I mean, natural learning, you know, like natural language toolkit, some things that you might not want to do. But again, really quickly, you're going to see code snippets out there, and you're going to want to run them in your notebook. And I think it's great just to have all the packages there. Andy?
Just last week, I helped a student install Anaconda on his Ubuntu machine.
Oh yeah, how did that work?
It didn't.
Oh no.
He gave up. We were trying to get Spider, and I knew you probably want to use some of the other packages too. But eventually gave up and just used the Ubuntu package manager to get Spider directly.
Okay, that's a good tip. The other, if you can't get Anaconda to work, there's another scientific distribution from an outfit called Enthought, E-N-T-H-O-U-G-H-T, and they have a Canopy distribution, and the free version of that is called Canopy Express. It doesn't have as many packages as Anaconda.
I think that there's a version of IPython in the app of Ubuntu in the app of browser apps when's the other app browser
Software center.
we should go to it.
I will point out, I put this on a slide that I skipped over. IPython is an easy install. There are a few other dependencies that have to get installed along with it if you want to run the notebook, things that run the server, and etc. So there's a command IPython all that you can install that should pull all of those down, or this is a list if you want to do them separately. You have a question, Lou?
I did. What's the code editing environment aside from those input code things? Do you do any kind of completion, or is it just literally a
Yes.
text area? Or is it
Ooh, I'm so glad you asked, because that's what gets into the IPython coolness. And I know that we are running out of time. So actually, I think I made a little demo notebook. There is completion. Because this runs on top of IPython, you get all of the IPython goodness. So if you have no interest in a notebook, but you're learning Python, get IPython and use their terminal. It's the best. So here is, well, one thing you can do is inspect the doc string, right? So you can see all this right here if you want to see what a function is. And then the tab completion comes here. So this is something called a data frame. This is a library called pandas that I use for data analysis. And so you can do the tab completion there. And the doc string inspection is great when you're working offline. And sort of goes back to that whole thing about education and context shifting, right? If I don't have to keep leaving the notebook, go look stuff up all over the internet, I can be more productive. Yeah, it's cool. Any other questions? All right, thank you all so much for coming. I appreciate your time.